Hi everyone, and thank you for coming to my senior TED Talk. I'm Kelsie Williams, if you didn't know, and I'll be talking about dissociative identity disorder, what it is, what causes it, and some of the treatments for it. So first, who has heard of this disorder before? Okay, and who has heard of it because of the movie Split by M. Night Shyamalan? Wow, most people I hear when I tell them about how I did a thesis on dissociative identity disorder, they're like, oh yeah, Split, that movie, what he had. It's like, yeah, what he had, kind of. Well, since Split, I'm going to talk about it a little bit because it shows the negative stigma some of the media puts on this disorder. As in the movie, Kevin Wendell Crumb, the main character, has 24 personalities, and he kidnaps 3 girls because of one of his other personalities that tends to want to kill people because they have not gone through trauma. And then other media, like the TV show United States of Terror, also goes through this, where there's an evil personality that tries to kill her family and stuff like this. There's just a tendency, even though it's obviously fictional and people know that usually, it still puts a negative light on people who have this disorder and that have to deal with it every day. So what is DID and what causes it? Well, DID is characterized by having 2 or more personalities and the inability to recall important personal information like your name, your date of birth, and stuff like that. As if when you have different personalities or alters, or you can call them identities, they don't really tend to know about the other ones unless there have been something that really brings to light that they are there. Alters will have amnesia between other parts. The host, which is the original personality, sometimes doesn't know and has blackouts, which is when another identity or personality will take over. You can have up to 100 alters they have found, but I know in 1950 the average was 3, and in 1990 the most was 6, and then recently it's gone up to around 13 that they have found in a normal case of DID. Now, what causes this is usually childhood trauma. Around 87% of patients with DID have been sexually abused as children, 85 have been physically abused, and then 79 have been emotionally abused. And one case of this is a case study by Marilyn Snow and Christopher Allers. And they found in this patient, John Drake, who had 17 different personalities. He just went in to help with anxiety. He had no idea he had DID until they told him. And they're like, oh yeah, you have this little personality, and his name is Johnny. He was stuck at the age of 8 years old. Some of the alters never age because they relive through their trauma in that personality. And Johnny had been sexually abused at the age of 8, and he dissociated into another personality, which was John Drake. John Drake was a personality meant to live for Johnny, to live without the knowledge of his sexual abuse. And so Johnny kind of stayed inside and wallowed in the pain of what had happened to him almost. But this is, once you get DID, you can create different alters for any sort of circumstances. Like John Drake ended up having another personality to manage his house. He thought he was incapable of doing such a thing and created another personality named Drake to do this for him. He also had, like I said, 17 alters, so he had 15 others. One of them to manage work, one to go to parties and social events for him that he felt he was unfit to do. Now, what can treat this? What treats somebody with 24 personalities or 17 personalities? What is even the treatment for that? Is it just for them to live a normal day life? It's to connect them into one person again? Because they are only one person. They might have many personalities, but it's only one person with this disorder. And usually it's therapy. There are two specific treatments for this. two specific treatments for DID. One of them is called the connective model, as I say. You can see throughout. There's not a specific name. I just gave the two treatments names. And the goal for the connective model is to for the patient to understand why they have these identities, and to understand their personalities. So the alters will all take a personality test. One of them is the current lifestyle assessment. There are 3 tests in total. And it will take the doctor months to find all of the alters, sometimes to get them to take these tests. And once they do, they usually make a diagram to show each alter why they have these alters and what they're there to do. Sometimes they figure out the trauma that is behind each alter to also share. Though usually in the connective model they don't look for what trauma caused the person to dissociate, at least especially in this model. And I know John Drake went through this treatment, and he figured out why he had all his alters. And afterwards, he found that after treatment, some of them were co-conscious, coexistent, or both, and he thought he lost some of his separateness that he had. He was remembering more stuff because his alters had become co-conscious. He knew what was going on instead of just having blank spaces in his memory. When they become coexistent, it's kind of like merging. Alters that are very similar to each other tend to merge, like two of John Drake's alters that specifically merged, was one named Guy and Drake that I mentioned earlier, who managed the household. Guy managed his work life, and they seemed similar enough that they thought they could merge, and that they seemed like one person, because to them they don't seem like one person, but once they get to that point they're like, oh, we're kind of like the same person, and they start to merge. So this doesn't happen with all of them, obviously. John Drake ended up having 10 alters by the end of his treatment because some of them merged. It seemed less though because they were still co-conscious for some of them. The other treatment that I have is what I call the trauma model. The purpose of it is to confront why the patient has DID and what caused it, and to get the person to understand that they are one person and not multiple people. This is done by going through each alter almost. They don't specifically look for an alter, but they will try to kind of find as many as they can. And they will talk to them of what memories they have, if they have any memories of trauma. And they will help them go through their trauma. Like one case of that shows this is a case of foster that was done by Richard Horvitz. And he would go through with the patient and all of his alters and be like, so what trauma have you gone through? Or sometimes the alter would just tell him. Like he had one that was named Little Foster, also a child alter. He was stuck at the age of 6, and he was also the host of the alters. He was the original personality, and he had his mother had attempted to drown him in a bathtub. And so he, like little Johnny, stayed at the age of 6 and kind of wallowed in what had happened. And what Dr. Horvitz did was help him understand that he couldn't have stopped what had happened to him. It wasn't his fault, like he kept on insisting that it was. He kept let little Foster understand that he didn't have to wallow and not process what had happened, that he needed to get through this, and that he could live a normal life even though this had happened to him. And as this happened, little Foster actually grew up in his head. He actually became the age of what Foster was, which was around 60. And this happened. He grew up from the age of 6 to 60 in the 2-month period of that therapy. And then 2 weeks later, little Foster and Foster found how similar they were, and they also merged. Now, one of the other alters that Foster had was the man from Mars, who was known to throw his feelings up to Mars to get rid of them. And Dr. Hurwitz helped him deal with his feelings and learn how to process his feelings. And once that happened, he also saw himself very similar to Foster, and they ended up merging about 3 weeks after the man from Mars figured out how to deal with his feelings and process them in a healthy way. And this, in the end, Foster had, he started with around 11 alters. In the end, all of them had merged. His therapy session was around 2 years in process, and he didn't dissociate afterwards, though he did have to keep on a regular therapy schedule, but it was only around 6 months for every session, while before he had to go about 5 times a week to help process all the trauma and all of the alters he had, while John Drake only did a year in therapy to process and to get connected to his alters. Because Foster merged more with his alters because the trauma is what's keeping them separated and what is to protect the person from what has happened. And so once that protection is kind of gone, like once that alter has dealt with that, they are no longer needed, and it's also a reason why they merge, especially in this case. Not exactly in John Drake's case, because they don't go over the trauma that has happened, but in Foster's case they do, and that's also a reason why some of his merged together. And that is actually all the treatments and the causes and what is really DID. I mean, now that you guys know this, I would hope you wouldn't let the negative stigma the media puts into our faces of what these patients are going through, because it's not easy for them. They went through so much to get to where they are, and they have a protection system to help them. While they might not want that help, they do sometimes treat it. Sometimes they like having the 10 alters they have and like being co-conscious with them, but having them to protect them, so they decide to keep alternate alters instead of like what Foster did, merge. John Drake wanted his protection from the world and those alters to help him out in life. And I hope with this information you can understand these people more and not think of, oh, sometimes these people will have evil alters, which will never be the case because they're there to protect them. Thank you.